The billionaire's deaf mother looked at Julian, her hands moving with a sharp, heartbreaking elegance. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He was just a waiter. He wasn't supposed to be a messenger for a family's pain. He turned to the formidable Eleanora Hayes, whose cold gray eyes were fixed on him, demanding an answer. "What?" Eleanora's voice was clipped, impatient. "What did she say?" Julian's gaze flickered back to the older woman, Genevieve, who stared at her daughter with a lifetime of disappointment in her eyes. He could lie. He could soften the blow, say something polite, something meaningless. It would be the safe thing to do. But the raw emotion in the mother's silent words felt too important to betray. He took a steadying breath. "She says," Julian said, his voice quiet but clear in the hushed, expensive restaurant, "she wonders if you would even notice if she disappeared from this table." The silence that crashed down was heavier than anything Julian had ever felt. Eleanora Hayes stared at him, her mask of corporate power cracking for just an instant, revealing a flash of raw, wounded shock. Then, her eyes narrowed, and her suspicion fell on him like a physical weight. In that moment, Julian knew he had done more than just translate a sentence. He had stepped into the middle of a war and made himself a target. Before Eleanora could formulate a response, her mother's hands moved again, this time in a smaller, more private gesture directed only at Julian. Her expression was apologetic, her movements conveying a deep, personal weariness. Julian's heart went out to her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his own expression softening with an understanding that felt far too intimate for the setting. That small, silent exchange was the final straw. To Eleanora, it looked like a conspiracy, a secret shared between her mother and this stranger, a secret she was excluded from. The waiter wasn't just a translator. He was an accomplice. "The check," Eleanora said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Her phone was already in her hand, the screen glowing beneath the table. "And you can leave the bottle." "Of course," Julian murmured, retreating from the table as quickly as he could without breaking into a run. He could feel Eleanora's gaze burning into his back, a sensation like ice and fire. As he turned away, he saw her thumb moving swiftly across her phone's screen. "The waiter at my table," she typed to her head of security. "Julian C., according to his name tag. I want everything on him." Now. The rest of Julian's shift passed in a blur of anxiety. He avoided table 12, sending another waiter to collect the payment, a tip so mechanically generous it felt more like an insult than a reward. Every shadow in the restaurant seemed to hold a new threat, every quiet conversation a potential discussion about him. He replayed the moment over and over in his head. It had started so simply. He'd seen the older woman, Genevieve, trying to get her daughter's attention, her hand gestures growing more and more frustrated as Eleanora remained glued to her phone, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of stock tickers and urgent emails. He had only approached because he recognized the loneliness in her eyes, a look he knew all too well. He'd learned sign language for his daughter, Lily, but in doing so, he had learned to see a world of silent conversations happening all around him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he had signed, approaching their table cautiously. "Is there anything I can get for you?" Genevieve's face had transformed with a surprise that quickly melted into relief. "You sign?" her hands had asked, a smile finally touching her lips. "Oh, thank heavens. I was just trying to ask about the sauce on the salmon." Their conversation had been brief and warm. He'd explained the ingredients, and she had told him it reminded her of a trip to the coast she'd taken with her late husband. It was only when Eleanora finally looked up, annoyed by the interruption, that Genevieve's frustration had boiled over, leading to the heartbreaking question that Julian had been forced to translate. The last thing she had signed to him, the secret that had so enraged her daughter, was simple and sad. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in the middle. It's just so lonely sometimes." His nod hadn't been an agreement to some scheme. It had been a simple acknowledgement of her pain. He knew what it was to be lonely in a crowded room. Finally, at midnight, his shift ended. The cold night air felt good on his flushed face as he walked to the bus stop. The meager tips from the night crumpled in his pocket. The encounter with Eleanora Hayes already felt surreal, like a scene from a movie. But the fear was real. A woman with that much power could crush a person like him without a second thought. She could get him fired. She could do worse. He tried to push the thought away. He had more important things to worry about. He had Lily. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood that the city's wealthy only saw from the windows of their town cars on the way to the airport. The contrast between the hushed elegance of the restaurant and the noisy, lived-in reality of his building was a gulf that Julian crossed every single day. But the moment he unlocked his door and stepped inside, the anxiety of the night began to recede. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who watched Lily after school, was dozing in his worn armchair. She blinked awake as he came in. "She was an angel, as always," the old woman whispered, gathering her things. "Finished her homework and was asleep by 9. "Thank you, Clara. I don't know what I'd do without you." He pressed a few of the crumpled bills from his pocket into her hand, ignoring her protests. After she left, he went to his daughter's room. Lily was curled up under a patchwork quilt, her small chest rising and falling in the soft glow of her rocket ship nightlight. Her hearing aids were on the bedside table, next to a drawing she'd made of a smiling girl with a dog. His heart ached with a love so fierce it was almost painful. She was his entire world, the reason for every long shift, every sacrifice, every fear. He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle. She had her mother's hair, the color of dark honey. A pang of grief, familiar and sharp, went through him. It had been 3 years since an illness had stolen his wife from them, leaving him with a mountain of medical debt and a hole in his life that could never be filled. All he had left of her was this beautiful, brilliant little girl. He went back into the small living room, the city's distant sirens a familiar lullaby. He sat at the small kitchen table and looked at the pile of bills waiting for him. The hospital, the collections agency, the rent. He was barely treading water, and a woman like Eleanora Hayes could create a tidal wave without even trying. As he stared out the window at the endless grid of city lights, he felt a profound sense of vulnerability. He was just one person, a single father trying to get by. He didn't know that miles away, in a sterile downtown office, a team of private investigators was already at work, digging into every corner of his life, commanded by the single, chilling text of a woman who now considered him a threat. He just knew that he had provoked something dangerous. He stood up and checked the deadbolt on the door, then checked it again. For the first time in a long time, Julian Croft was afraid of what the morning might bring. The morning light was a pale, sterile gray, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eleanora Hayes's penthouse. The view stretched from the Hudson to the East River, a kingdom of glass and steel she commanded from her throne of Italian leather. At 7 a.m., she had already been working for 2 hours, her breakfast an untouched plate of fruit, her coffee a cold, bitter necessity. The silence in her home was absolute, broken only by the soft clicks of her keyboard. It was the way she liked it, orderly, controlled, predictable. The incident at the restaurant was an anomaly she was determined to correct. People were data points, their actions predictable variables in a complex equation. The waiter, Julian Croft, was an unknown variable, and she despised unknowns. She expected the file on her desk to confirm her initial hypothesis. He was a grifter, a small-time predator who targeted the wealthy and vulnerable. It was a pattern she had seen 100 times. Her head of security, a lean, expressionless man named Corbin, entered the room without a sound and placed a thin tablet on her desk. "The preliminary report on Julian Croft, Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice as neutral as his suit. "Give me the summary," she said, not looking up from her work. "I assume he has a record." "No, ma'am." "He doesn't." Eleanora's fingers paused over her keyboard. She looked up. "Nothing?" "Not so much as a speeding ticket," Corbin confirmed. "He is, for all intents and purposes, completely clean." This was not the answer she expected. Annoyed, she picked up the tablet. The first page was a standard profile. Julian Croft, age 32, resident of Queens. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no bankruptcies. She swiped to the next page, and the narrative of his life began to unfold. A story so contrary to her expectations that she felt a strange sense of disorientation. He'd been a brilliant student, a full scholarship to a prestigious university, majoring in linguistics with a near-perfect grade point average. Then, in his final year, he had dropped out. The reason was listed below. His high school sweetheart and wife, Sarah Croft, had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer. The report was brutally efficient. It detailed a 2-year battle against the disease, a litany of treatments, hospital stays, and experimental therapies. It included a summary of their finances, showing how their small savings had evaporated, how they'd sold their car, how Julian had taken on 3 jobs while still trying to care for her. And then, the final, stark entry: Sarah Croft, deceased, age 27. The outstanding medical debt was a staggering 6-figure sum that still hung over Julian's head. Eleanora felt a tightening in her chest. She scrolled further. A year after his wife's death, the report detailed the birth of their daughter, Lily. A note from a pediatric specialist confirmed a diagnosis at 18 months. Lily was profoundly deaf. Corbin had been thorough. The file contained discreetly obtained photographs. One showed Julian at a playground, his face alight with joy as he pushed a laughing little girl on a swing. Another showed them sitting on a park bench, his hands a blur of motion as they conversed in sign language, their connection obvious and absolute. There were pictures of his shabby apartment building, of the well-worn route he took to the bus stop, of the second job he worked as a daytime stocker at a grocery store. The data was irrefutable. This was not the profile of a con artist. This was the profile of a man who had been battered by life and had not only refused to break, but had dedicated himself completely to the small, bright world of his daughter. The shame hit her unexpectedly, a hot, unfamiliar feeling. Her suspicion from the night before now seemed cheap and ugly. The memory of her own coldness made her flinch. She had looked at this man and seen a predator, when in fact he was a survivor, a father whose devotion she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her personal tablet buzzed on the desk. It was a video call from her mother. Annoyed at the interruption, she answered. Genevieve's face appeared, her expression hopeful. "Good morning," she signed, her movements slow so Eleanora could understand. "Did you find him? The nice young man from the restaurant?" "Mother, I'm busy," Eleanora said, her voice sharper than she intended. Genevieve's face fell, but she persisted. "I want to see him again." He was kind. He listened. Her hands formed the sign for listened with an emphasis that was almost an accusation. "I'll look into it," Eleanora said, already preparing to end the call. But she paused. For the first time in years, her mother was animated, engaged. She wasn't retreating into her silent world. She was reaching out. And it was all because of him. Because of Julian Croft. "I have to go," she said abruptly, and ended the call. She dismissed Corbin with a wave of her hand. Alone again, she stared at the tablet, at the picture of Julian and Lily on the park bench. She, Eleanora Hayes, solved problems. She acquired assets, eliminated liabilities, and optimized systems. Her mother's loneliness was a problem she had tried to solve with money, with nurses, with companions who were all wrong. She had tried to fix a human problem with financial solutions. And last night, a man who had nothing had connected with her mother in a way she never could. He wasn't a liability. He was a potential asset. A solution. She picked up her phone. Her decision made. Her thumb moved across the screen, sending a new message to Corbin, one that was precise and decisive. Find out where Julian Croft works his day shift. I'm going to pay him a visit. The fluorescent lights of the quick and fresh grocery store hummed a dreary, monotonous tune. It was a world away from the crystal chandeliers and hushed ambiance of the restaurant where Julian worked his nights. Here, the air smelled of disinfectant and overripe bananas. This was his day job, the one that offered a small but vital health insurance plan for Lily. It was mindless, back-breaking work. And today, Julian was grateful for it. Stocking shelves required no thought, and he had been doing too much of that for the past 2 days, his mind replaying the encounter with Eleanora Hayes on a loop. He was in aisle 4, stacking cans of chicken noodle soup, when a strange silence fell over the store. The usual cacophony of shopping carts and beeping scanners seemed to fade. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, expecting to see his manager, but the figure standing before him was so out of place, it felt like a hallucination. Eleanora Hayes stood there, dressed in a sharp, dark gray suit that probably cost more than he made in 3 months. Her expensive heels were silent on the scuffed linoleum floor. Her presence was a stark slash of color in a black and white world. A few shoppers stared, mesmerized. Julian scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind raced. She'd found him. She was here to finish what she'd started, to have him fired from this job too, to make sure he was well and truly ruined. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He wiped his dusty hands on his apron. I don't know what you're doing here, but I promise I didn't mean any disrespect the other night. I was just doing my job." "No, you weren't," she said, her voice calm and even. It cut through the hum of the store. "You went beyond your job." And I was wrong. The words hung in the air between the canned peas and the creamed corn. Julian stared at her, utterly bewildered. An apology was the last thing he had ever expected to hear from this woman. "I misjudged you," she continued, the admission sounding practiced, as if she'd rehearsed it. "My reaction was unprofessional." He didn't know what to say. He just watched as she took a small step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I ran a background check on you, Mr. Croft." The whiplash was dizzying. The flicker of relief he'd felt vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. "You what?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You had no right to do that." "I know," she conceded, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "It was a severe invasion of your privacy. And for that, I am truly sorry. But the information it provided confirmed something my mother already knew from the moment she met you. That you're a decent man." Julian felt like the floor was tilting beneath his feet. He couldn't process the conversation. It made no sense. Eleanora got straight to the point, as she always did. "I'm here to offer you a job. Not as a stock boy. I want you to work for me." "Doing what?" he asked, his suspicion returning full force. "Not for me, precisely. For my mother," she clarified. "I want to hire you as her personal interpreter and companion. To be a bridge for her to the world she's been cut off from." She named a salary, a number so large that Julian thought he must have misheard. It was more than he made in a year from both of his jobs combined. It was enough to pay off every last cent of Sarah's medical debt. It was enough to give Lily everything she ever wanted. He recoiled as if she'd struck him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't want your charity." "I don't need your pity, Ms. Hayes." "This isn't pity," she insisted, and for the first time, her voice lost its corporate polish and held a note of raw frustration, a hint of vulnerability. "Believe me, I am not a charitable person. This is a business proposition. My mother's happiness is an asset I have failed to secure. Her isolation is a liability I have failed to mitigate. You, Mr. Croft, are a solution." She looked away for a second, towards the front of the store, as if gathering her thoughts. For the first time since my father passed away, she connected with someone. For 5 minutes in a restaurant. She wasn't lonely. That is valuable to me. More valuable than the salary I am offering you. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple, heavy business card, holding it out to him. It was stark white, with her name and a single phone number embossed in black. "The offer is real," she said. "Your hours would be your own. Your only responsibility would be to spend time with her, to take her places, to talk to her, to give her back a piece of the world she has lost." Julian looked from the card to her face. He saw no deception there, only a kind of desperate pragmatism. She saw a problem and was willing to pay to fix it. He and his daughter were just collateral benefits. "Think about it," she said softly. "Call me when you've made your decision." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Her exit was as quiet and impactful as her arrival. The other employees just stared, their mouths agape. Julian stood frozen in the soup aisle, the small, heavy card feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He looked down at the can of soup still clutched in his other hand, its label promising comfort for 99 cents. Then he looked back at the card, which promised an escape from a life defined by that price tag. It was an impossible choice, a lifeline from a world he didn't belong in, offered by a woman he wasn't sure he could ever trust. Julian worked the rest of his shift in a fog. The mundane tasks of scanning barcodes and bagging groceries felt dreamlike and distant. His mind was a battlefield. One side, the cautious, wounded part of him, screamed that Eleanora Hayes's offer was a trap. People like her didn't help people like him. They used them. They were pieces in a game so complex he couldn't even see the board. She had investigated him, violated his privacy without a second thought. How could he possibly trust a woman whose first instinct was to treat him like a criminal? But the other side of him, the desperate, exhausted father, saw the offer for what it was. A miracle. A lifeline. The number she had named echoed in his ears. It was more than just money. It was freedom. It was the end of the crippling anxiety that came with every final notice in the mail. It was the ability to fix the rattling noise in their old refrigerator, to buy Lily new winter boots without having to skip meals, to finally pay off the last of the hospital bills that felt like a monument to his wife's memory. He walked home, Eleanora's stark white business card feeling like a hot coal in his pocket. When he opened the door to his apartment, the argument in his head went quiet. The sight of his small, worn-out living space was the only evidence he needed. The couch had a tear in the armrest he'd tried to patch. The rug was frayed at the edges. A water stain bloomed on the ceiling from a leak in the apartment above. This wasn't a life. It was a holding pattern. Lily was at the kitchen table, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she worked on a drawing for school. She looked up when he came in, her face breaking into a wide, luminous smile. "Hi, Daddy," she signed, her small hands moving with an energetic grace that always made his heart ache. "Hi, my little star," he signed back, dropping his bag and crouching beside her. "What are you drawing?" She proudly held up her paper. It was a picture of him. On one side, he was holding a mop at the restaurant. On the other, he was holding a price scanner at the grocery store. The assignment was, "What my parents do." His chest tightened. He was proud of his work. It was honest, and it kept them fed. But seeing it through her eyes, reduced to these simple, tired tools, felt like a punch to the gut. "What was your job before, Daddy?" Lily signed, her expression curious. "When Mommy was here." Julian rarely talked about those years. It was a different life, a different man. He hesitated, then sat down across from her. "I went to a big school, a university." He signed slowly. "I studied languages, words, how people talk to each other." Lily's eyes widened. "Like we talk?" "Exactly like we talk," he confirmed, a sad smile touching his lips. "I loved it." She looked down at her drawing of him, then back up, her gaze serious and full of a child's simple, profound wisdom. "I wish you had a job that made you smile like that again." And just like that, the war in his head was over. Her words had cut through all his pride, all his fear, and all his suspicion. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about his mistrust of Eleanor Hayes. It was about Lily. It was about giving her a father who wasn't just a ghost of himself, worn down by exhaustion and worry. This job wasn't a handout. It was a chance to use his mind again, a chance to do something that wasn't just about survival, a chance, he realized with a jolt, to be the man his wife had fallen in love with. His hand was trembling as he pulled the business card from his pocket. He stared at the number, his heart pounding. He was about to make a call that would change everything. He walked into his small bedroom for privacy and dialed. It rang only once. "Hayes." Her voice was crisp, professional, as if she were in the middle of a boardroom. "Ms. Hayes, it's Julian Croft." There was a brief pause. "Mr. Croft, I was wondering if you would call. I've thought about your offer," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll take the job. But I have two conditions." Silence. He could almost feel her surprise through the line. People like him didn't make conditions to people like her. "Conditions?" she finally asked, a note of incredulous curiosity in her tone. "First, my daughter comes first." "Always," Julian said, his voice gaining strength. "My hours have to be completely flexible. If she's sick, if she has a school event, if she has a doctor's appointment, I'm with her." "No questions asked." "That's reasonable," she conceded. "And the second?" "I report to your mother," he said firmly. "Not to you. My job is with her. Our schedule, what we do, where we go. That's between us. I'll send you a summary of my hours for payment, but that's it. I'm not your employee, Ms. Hayes. I'm your mother's companion." This time, the silence was longer. He had just drawn a line in the sand, establishing a boundary she was not used to encountering. He held his breath, expecting her to tell him the deal was off. "Acceptable," she said finally. The word was clipped, but it held. "My assistant will draft a contract and email it to you within the hour. You can start tomorrow." Before he could respond, she had hung up. Julian lowered the phone, a wave of adrenaline washing over him. It was a mixture of pure terror and a wild, unfamiliar hope. He had just made a deal with one of the most powerful women in the city, and he had done it on his own terms. He walked back into the living room and looked at Lily, who was now coloring in the sky behind the drawing of him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had made the right decision. He had just stepped off a cliff for her, with no idea if he was about to fly or fall. Julian's first day began in front of a building that seemed to scrape the sky. The Hayes Tower was a monument of shimmering glass and black steel, a place so far removed from his reality that he felt like he needed a passport to enter. He had spent an hour that morning deciding what to wear, finally settling on his only pair of good trousers and a simple button-down shirt. Standing at the entrance, watching impeccably dressed people sweep in and out, he felt like a child wearing his father's shoes. A man in a severe black suit, Corbin, he presumed, met him in the lobby. He didn't introduce himself, simply nodding once before leading Julian to a private elevator. The ride was silent and swift, a smooth ascent into another world. The doors opened directly into Eleanor's penthouse. The space was vast, minimalist, and cold, more like an art gallery than a home. White walls, sparse, modern furniture, and panoramic views of the city that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of beautiful that felt lonely. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen, but her mother, Genevieve, was sitting in a sun-filled corner, a book open in her lap. She looked up as Julian entered, and a genuine, radiant smile spread across her face. She set her book aside and stood to greet him. "I was so hoping you would come," she signed, her eyes sparkling with a life he hadn't seen in the restaurant. "The offer was too good to refuse," Julian signed back, a small, nervous smile on his own face. "My daughter can be a force of nature when she wants something," Genevieve acknowledged, a hint of wry amusement in her expression. "She is very persuasive," Julian agreed. The initial awkwardness melted away with surprising speed. Genevieve was warm, inquisitive, and had a sharp sense of humor. She asked him about Lily, and Julian's nervousness vanished as he proudly showed her pictures on his phone. He told her about Lily's love for drawing, her stubborn independence, and her wild imagination. Genevieve's eyes softened. "She is beautiful. You are a good father." Then she looked around the cavernous, silent apartment. Eleonora was like her once, before her father died, before she decided she needed to build all of this. Her hands made a gesture that encompassed the entire penthouse to keep the world out. It was a small glimpse behind the corporate armor, a hint of the woman beneath the billionaire. After another hour of pleasant conversation, Genevieve grew restless. She looked out the window, not at the sprawling city, but at a patch of green in the distance. "I'm tired of these walls," she sighed, her expression suddenly wistful. "I want to go out, not to a store or a museum. I want to go to the park, the one downtown, with the old carousel." Julian was taken aback. It was such a simple request. Of course, he signed immediately. "Let's go." The afternoon was a revelation. In the open air of the park, surrounded by the laughter of children and the rumble of the city, Genevieve came alive. She was no longer the fragile, lonely woman from the restaurant, but a vibrant, funny person who had been starved for normal life. They walked along the paths, their hands in constant, flowing conversation. She told him about meeting her husband, and he told her about meeting Sarah. They discovered a shared love for old movies and a mutual dislike for modern art. He bought them hot dogs from a street vendor, and they sat on a bench, eating and laughing. For Julian, the experience was utterly surreal. He was being paid a fortune to do this, to simply enjoy a beautiful day with a kind woman. For the first time, the job didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a friendship. When he helped her onto the brightly painted horse of the carousel, her joyous, uninhibited laughter was a sound he couldn't hear, but a sight he would never forget. He felt his own smile, a real one, the kind Lily had wished for. As they were leaving the park, feeling light and happy, a sleek, dark sedan pulled up to the curb. Julian instinctively moved slightly in front of Genevieve. The tinted window slid down, and a man in a perfectly tailored suit leaned over from the driver's seat. He had a smile that was polished to a high sheen, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," the man said smoothly, "I was in the neighborhood. Eleonora asked me to check in, make sure you were enjoying your afternoon." Genevieve's smile tightened. She gave the man a cool nod. He got out of the car, his gaze immediately landing on Julian, sweeping over him from his worn shoes to his simple shirt in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "And you must be Mr. Croft," he said, extending a hand. "Gareth Cromwell. I'm a senior vice president at Hayes Corp. Eleonora has told me so much about you." Julian shook his hand, feeling a chill at the man's firm, proprietary grip. The words were friendly, but the tone was laced with something else, a subtle warning, a territorial claim. Genevieve touched Julian's arm, drawing his attention. She signed discreetly, her body shielding the gesture from Gareth's view. He is a wolf who learned how to smile. "We were just heading back," Julian said to Gareth, keeping his voice neutral. "Thank you for stopping." "Nonsense, let me give you a ride," Gareth offered, his smile unwavering. "We prefer to walk," Julian replied politely but firmly, leaving no room for argument. Gareth's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before the polished mask slipped back into place. "Of course. Have a wonderful day." He got back in his car and drove off, but Julian could feel his eyes on them in the rear-view mirror. The encounter, brief as it was, had punctured the day's perfect bubble. Julian looked at Genevieve, who seemed to have shrunk back into herself slightly. The light in her eyes dimmed. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach, that he had just met the real danger in Eleonora Hayes's world. It wasn't the sharp-tongued CEO he had to worry about. It was the smiling man in her inner circle. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both dreamlike and wonderfully real. Julian's life had been completely remade. The exhaustion that had been his constant companion for years began to recede. The dark circles under his eyes faded. He quit the grocery store then, with a deep sense of relief. He worked his final shift at the restaurant. His days now belonged to Genevieve, and by extension, to Lily. He was able to walk Lily to school every morning and be there to pick her up every afternoon, a simple luxury that felt like the greatest wealth in the world. They had time for parks, for museums, for homework at the kitchen table without him half asleep on his feet. Lily blossomed under the full sun of his attention. His friendship with Genevieve deepened into something rich and familial. She was no longer just his employer, she was his confidant. He told her about Sarah, and she told him about her husband, Thomas. They discovered a shared history of loving deeply and losing devastatingly. She became a grandmother to him, a steady, warm presence in a life that had been sorely lacking one. His interactions with Eleonora were, as he had demanded, almost non-existent. He emailed a simple invoice for his hours at the end of each week, and the money would appear in his bank account the next day, transferred by an anonymous assistant. But he knew she was watching from a distance. During her daily video calls with her mother, Genevieve's hands were a constant flurry of stories about him. Julian and I went to the botanical gardens today. The orchids were beautiful. Julian says Lily learned to ride her bike without training wheels. Julian thinks you work too hard. Eleonora would listen with an unreadable expression, her responses brief. But Julian could feel her presence, a silent observer in the background of his new life. Then, one afternoon, Genevieve issued a command. "We are having dinner," she signed to Julian, her expression leaving no room for argument. "A proper one. Here, Friday night, you will bring Lily. I will cook." She presented the same command to Eleonora, who, for the first time in their relationship, Julian learned, was rendered speechless. Her penthouse, her fortress of solitude, was to be invaded by a 7-year-old child. But Genevieve was happier and healthier than she had been in a decade, and Eleonora knew who to thank for it. Reluctantly, she agreed. Friday evening arrived, charged with a nervous energy. Julian and Lily rode the silent elevator up, Lily clutching a folded piece of drawing paper in her hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. When the doors opened, Genevieve was there to greet them, wrapping Lily in a warm hug. Eleonora stood awkwardly in the background. She was dressed in simple slacks and a silk blouse, a clear attempt at casual, but she still looked like a CEO commanding a hostile takeover. She had no idea how to act around a child. "Hello, Lily," she said, her voice a bit too formal. "It's a pleasure to have you in my home." Lily hid behind Julian's legs, but Genevieve, the master of this new family dynamic, smoothly bridged the gap. The evening progressed, stilted at first, but gradually warming. Lily, seeing Genevieve's easy affection, slowly came out of her shell. After dinner, she walked shyly over to Eleonora, her small hand outstretched, holding the folded paper. "This is for you," Julian translated for her. Eleonora took it, a look of confusion on her face. She unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, cheerful crayon. 4 stick figures stood under a massive, multicolored rainbow. She could recognize her mother's silver hair, Julian's taller frame, and Lily's smiling face. And then she saw the 4th figure, the one with the dark hair, holding her mother's hand. Her. Something inside Eleonora, something she thought had turned to stone years ago, shifted. No one had given her a gift like this, a thing of no monetary value, a thing of pure, simple affection, since she herself had been a child. "Thank you, Lily," she said, and her voice was soft, stripped of its usual armor. "It's beautiful. I'm going to put it in a very special place." Later, while Genevieve and Lily were on the floor working on a large puzzle together, Eleonora found Julian in the kitchen, helping to clear the plates. "Thank you," she said quietly, startling him. He turned to face her. "For what you've done for my mother." She hasn't been this happy in years. She paused, glancing towards the living room. "And for the picture." "Lily wanted to make it," Julian said. "She was excited to meet her grandmother's daughter." The words hung in the air. Her grandmother's daughter. Not the billionaire CEO. Not Ms. Hayes. Eleonora leaned against the counter, a gesture of weariness he'd never seen from her before. "My father. He was the one who could always make my mother laugh," she said, her voice distant. "After he was gone, I didn't know how. I only knew how to build walls to protect what was left. I think I built them so high I locked her inside with me." "You were just trying to keep her safe," Julian said softly. "Was I?" she mused, her gaze turning to him. "Or was I just hiding too?" It was the first real conversation they had ever had. Not a confrontation, not a negotiation. Just two people standing in a quiet kitchen, sharing a moment of unguarded truth. The air between them shifted, charged with a new, unspoken potential. The evening ended on a note of gentle warmth. As Julian and Lily prepared to leave, Eleonora carefully placed Lily's drawing on the gleaming, empty door of her multi-$1,000 refrigerator, securing it with a magnet. It looked wonderfully, ridiculously out of place. As the elevator doors closed on Julian and his smiling, sleepy daughter, Eleonora's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a text from Gareth. "Hope you're having a relaxing evening. Just closed the Henderson deal. We should celebrate, just the two of us." The message was a cold splash of reality. It was a reminder of her other life, the one of relentless ambition, of predatory smiles and men like Gareth who saw her as a prize to be won. She looked from the glowing screen of her phone to the child's drawing on her fridge. For the first time, Eleonora Hayes felt torn not between two business decisions, but between two different worlds, and she was no longer sure which one was real. The dinner party marked a subtle but profound shift. Eleonora found herself walking past her refrigerator multiple times a day, her eyes drawn to the colorful crayon drawing. It was a beacon of chaotic, simple joy in her meticulously ordered world. The memory of the evening, of the easy laughter between Julian and her mother, of Lily's unabashed awe, stayed with her. It felt like a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed shut for years, and she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about the fresh air. Her interactions with Gareth became strained. His texts and calls, once a familiar part of her professional life, now felt intrusive, tinged with an ambition she was beginning to find repulsive. When he suggested they celebrate the Henderson deal, she put him off with a curt, non-committal reply. She was busy. Gareth noticed the change immediately. He was a student of power, and he saw Eleonora's attention shifting. This waiter, this nobody, was becoming more than just an employee. He was a distraction, an emotional variable that Gareth could not control. And what Gareth couldn't control, he destroyed. His initial searches for dirt on Julian had come up empty, revealing only a tiresome story of tragedy and paternal devotion. So, if there was no dirt to be found, he would have to plant some. His target was chosen with surgical precision: Genevieve's jewelry. Specifically, the Star of Ardennes, a breathtaking diamond necklace Thomas Hayes had given his wife for their 20th anniversary. It was Genevieve's most cherished possession and Eleonora's most tangible link to her father's memory. It was kept in a state-of-the-art safe in Genevieve's dressing room, a vault within the fortress of the penthouse. Its value was immense, but its sentimental worth was incalculable. With the cool efficiency of a corporate takeover, Gareth made his arrangements. He presented Eleonora with a proposal for a comprehensive security upgrade for the entire Hayes Tower, citing a recent, entirely fictional spike in high-end residential crime. Preoccupied, she signed off on it without a second thought. The technicians who arrived were not from the security firm. They were discreet specialists on Gareth's private payroll, While they went through the motions of upgrading systems, one of them spent 10 minutes in Genevieve's dressing room. He didn't crack the safe. He simply used a sophisticated device to temporarily disable the silent alarm sensor on the door and, most critically, to clone the master keycard that Eleonora had issued to Julian. Meanwhile, Julian's world was bathed in a light he had almost forgotten existed. He had moved them into a small but clean 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, safe neighborhood with a good school for Lily. He'd enrolled her in an after-school arts program for deaf and hard-of-hearing children, where she was thriving. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, he could breathe. He could sleep through the night without the crushing weight of debt pressing down on his chest. He felt a deep, abiding gratitude to Genevieve, and by extension, to the enigmatic woman who had made it all possible. He found himself thinking about Eleonora more often, wondering about the sad, guarded woman he'd glimpsed in the kitchen that night. The trap was set. All Gareth needed was to get Julian into the penthouse, alone. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon. Gareth, knowing Eleonora was locked in back-to-back meetings across town, had an assistant place a frantic call to Genevieve about a sudden issue with a charity gala she was sponsoring. It was a well-crafted lie, urgent enough to pull her away from the penthouse for several hours. Minutes after she left, Julian's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Croft? This is Chloe from Ms. Hayes' executive office," a crisp, professional voice said. "So sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Hayes seems to have forgotten a rather important portfolio for her gala meeting. Ms. Hayes has asked if you would be so kind as to pop over to the penthouse and retrieve it for her. It's a blue leather folder on the desk in her study." It seemed like a perfectly normal request. "Of course," Julian said without hesitation. "I can be there in 20 minutes. He took the subway downtown, used the key card to access the private elevator, and let himself into the silent apartment. It felt strange to be there without Genevieve. He found the blue folder exactly where the assistant had said it would be, and was in and out of the penthouse in less than 15 minutes. He dropped the folder off with the building's concierge to be messengered to the gala, and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, the world fell apart. Julian was with Genevieve at the city library when her phone began vibrating violently. It was Eleonora. Genevieve answered the video call, a smile on her face that quickly vanished. Julian could see Eleonora on the small screen, her face pale, her expression frantic. Her hands were shaking as she signed. "It's gone. Mom, it's gone." Genevieve's hands flew to her own throat. "Number, not the star. Ellie, no. The safe is open. It's empty. Someone came in. There was no forced entry." Julian's blood ran cold. He helped a trembling Genevieve into a taxi, and they rushed back to the penthouse. It was already a crime scene, swarming with private security. Eleonora was standing in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. And then Gareth was there. He appeared at Eleonora's side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, his face a mask of grave concern. "We've reviewed the security logs for the past 24 hours, Gareth said, his voice low and solemn. There was no breach of the building's perimeter. No unauthorized access to the elevator. He paused, taking a deep, theatrical breath. "Eleonora, there was only one person who entered the penthouse while your mother was out yesterday afternoon." He turned his head slowly, his cold eyes landing on Julian. Eleonora's gaze followed his. She stared at Julian, her face a storm of confusion, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening horror. The brief warmth that had begun to grow between them was instantly extinguished, replaced by the icy suspicion he remembered from that first night. "The logs show he was in the apartment for 14 minutes, Gareth continued softly, twisting the knife. "Alone." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. The air in the room became thin, impossible to breathe. Every eye was on him. Corbin's professional neutrality, Genevieve's horrified confusion, Gareth's feigned sympathy, and Eleonora's, which were a maelstrom of shock and betrayal. "What?" Julian stammered, the word catching in his throat. No, I came to get a folder for your mother. Your assistant, Chloe, she called me. He looked at Eleonora, desperate for her to understand, to believe him, but her focus shifted to Gareth. Gareth shook his head with practiced sadness. Eleonora, I've already confirmed with your entire executive staff. There is no one named Chloe in your office. No one made that call. The lie was so smooth, so absolute, that for a split second, Julian questioned his own memory. The trap was perfect. It was his word, the word of a man who was a janitor a month ago, against the logical, documented evidence of her own security system and the word of her trusted vice president. Eleonora, please, Julian pleaded, taking a step toward her. You have to believe me. I would never. Why would I do this? After everything you've done for me, for my daughter. It was Gareth who answered, his voice a low, poisonous murmur meant only for Eleonora's ears, but loud enough for Julian to hear. The man was drowning in debt not 30 days ago. You gave him access to a world he could only dream of. It's a classic story of temptation, Ellie. You offered him a taste, and it simply wasn't enough. Each word was a hammer blow, constructing a motive so plausible that it shattered the fragile trust between them. Julian saw it happen in Eleonora's eyes. He saw the warmth from their kitchen conversation die. He saw the memory of Lily's drawing burn to ash. He saw the return of the cold, suspicious woman from the restaurant, the woman who had investigated him, the woman whose first instinct had been to believe the worst. Her face was a mask of stone, but her eyes were glistening with the tears of a woman who felt like a fool for having dared to let her guard down. Get out, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was dead, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice she used to kill billion-dollar deals, to fire executives, to erase problems. Get out of my home. Ellie, no, Genevieve whispered, but Eleonora wasn't listening. Julian's shoulders slumped. It was over. He had flown too close to the sun, and his wings had just melted. He felt a despair so profound it was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He turned to leave, his entire future erased in a single, perfectly executed lie. But a figure stepped in his path. It was Genevieve. She stood before him, small and frail, but with a fire in her eyes that made her seem taller. She turned that fierce gaze on her daughter. No, she signed, her hands slicing through the air with an authority Eleonora had not seen since her father was alive. You are wrong. Stop and think. Not this man. Never him. Mother, please, this is not the time, Eleonora said, her voice trembling with the effort of holding herself together. You see a security log. Genevieve's hands shot back, her movements sharp with anger. I see a man's character. You are letting this wolf, she threw a venomous glare at Gareth, fill your head with poison. Open your eyes. It was an unprecedented challenge. Genevieve had never once contradicted Eleonora with such force. The sheer power of her conviction planted a microscopic seed of doubt in the scorched earth of Eleonora's certainty. But it was not enough to take root. She was too hurt, too raw. Julian looked at the woman defending him, his heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it brought tears to his eyes. It wasn't me, Genevieve, he said, his voice thick with emotion, speaking and signing the words so she would know their truth. I swear to you. He gave her one last, desperate look, then walked around her and out of the apartment, the heavy doors closing behind him with a final, damning click. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Gareth moved to comfort Eleonora, but she flinched away from his touch. She was staring at her mother, who was still standing by the door, her expression one of bitter disappointment. Genevieve's gaze was fixed on Gareth. She watched his every move, every comforting word he spoke to her daughter, every feigned look of concern. She knew Julian was innocent, which meant she was in the same room as a very accomplished liar and a thief. And her mind, sharp and observant, began to race. Julian rode the elevator down in a state of shock. He stumbled out into the bustling city street, a ghost in the afternoon sun. The beautiful new apartment, the art program, the quiet hum of security in his life. It was all gone. It had all been a fantasy, and he had just been brutally awakened. He walked into his home, a place that yesterday had felt like a new beginning and today felt like a gilded cage he was about to be evicted from. Lily ran to him, hugging his legs, her face bright with an innocent joy that shattered his heart. She held up a drawing from her art class, a vibrant picture of a soaring bird. He knelt and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with silent sobs. He had no job. His name was destroyed, and he was terrified that at any moment the police would come knocking on his door. The hope he had so foolishly allowed himself to feel was gone, replaced by the cold, familiar terror of a man with everything to lose. The silence in the penthouse was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. For 2 days, Eleonora had been a phantom in her own home, moving from her office to her bedroom, her face a pale, impenetrable mask. She had canceled all her meetings, delegating her entire empire to her subordinates. The theft of the necklace was a painful blow, but the betrayal of Julian Croft was a wound that had shattered something deep inside her. But Genevieve was not idle. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime observing a world she could not hear, and it had sharpened her other senses, especially her intuition. She watched her daughter grieve a betrayal that had never happened, and she watched Gareth Cromwell circle like a vulture, offering sympathy that was as hollow as a drum. She knew Julian was innocent, and in the cold, clear logic of her silent world, that meant Gareth was guilty. She sat in the sun-filled corner where she and Julian had first talked, and she thought. She replayed every detail. Julian's shock, Gareth's smooth accusations. The key was the phone call. The phantom assistant, Chloe. It was the only part of Gareth's story that felt clumsy, an overreach. He hadn't just relied on the security footage. He had invented a lure. Why? To make Julian's presence in the apartment seem premeditated and suspicious. It was the work of a man trying too hard. That afternoon, she walked into Eleonora's home office. Her daughter didn't look up from the tablet where she was aimlessly scrolling through market reports. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," Genevieve signed, her movements sharp and certain. "The evidence was clear, Mother." Eleonora's voice was flat. "Please, let's not discuss it." "Evidence can be faked," Genevieve shot back. "You, who can see the flaw in a 10,000-page financial projection, are blind to the lie right in front of your face. Why? Because it's easier to believe the waiter is a thief than to believe your trusted colleague is a monster." Eleonora finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "What do you want me to do?" "He was there. The necklace is gone, think," Genevieve insisted, stepping closer. "Use that brilliant mind I gave you. Ask yourself, who benefits the most from this? And then, find the flaw in his story." Julian said an assistant named Chloe called him. Gareth denied it. "You stopped there, but you should have kept digging." She leaned over the desk, forcing her daughter to look at her. "Get Julian's phone records for that afternoon. Not your office call logs, his. A phone number is a piece of data, Eleonora. Follow the data. It will not lie to you." It was a direct challenge, an appeal not to her daughter's heart, but to her intellect. It was the only language Eleonora was still fluent in. A flicker of the old, sharp-witted CEO returned to her eyes. She was hurt, but her mother was right. She had stopped digging. She had accepted Gareth's word as fact, something she never did in business. She picked up her phone and dialed her head of security. "Corbin," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. "I need you to get me the full activity log for Julian Croft's personal cell phone for Tuesday afternoon. I'm finalizing my report for the police. I need it immediately." An hour later, Corbin stood in her office, a tablet in his hand. "You were right to be suspicious, Miss Hayes," he said quietly. just not of the right person. He laid the tablet on her desk. On the screen was the call log from Julian's phone. A single incoming call at 2:15 p.m. on Tuesday. The number was flagged as belonging to a disposable burner phone. The phone was activated Monday evening, Corbin explained, his voice grim. It was used to make one call on Tuesday. It has been inactive ever since. We traced the purchase location. He swiped the screen. A new image appeared. A grainy security still from a 24-hour convenience store. A man in a baseball cap was at the counter, paying cash for a small box. Even with the hat pulled low, there was no mistaking the sharp jawline, the expensive watch on his wrist. It was Gareth Cromwell. The truth hit Eleonora with the force of a physical impact. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated plot. Gareth had framed him. He had manipulated her, played on her deepest fears of being used, and turned her into a weapon against an innocent man. The shame was a tidal wave, hot and suffocating. She saw Julian's face in her mind, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. She heard her own voice, cold and dead, ordering him out of her home. She saw him turning away, destroyed. She had been the fool. She had allowed her pride and her suspicion to make her a pawn in Gareth's disgusting game. The grief over the stolen necklace vanished, replaced by a rage so pure and cold it steadied her shaking hands. She looked up at Corbin, her face pale, but her eyes now chips of ice. The wounded woman was gone. The CEO was back. "Get me Gareth," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Tell him I need to see him in my office to discuss his promotion." Effective immediately, Gareth Cromwell walked into Eleonora's office with the confident stride of a conquering hero. The summons had been exactly what he was waiting for. With the waiter gone, his path to Eleonora's side, and to the power that came with it, was finally clear. He found her standing by the window, her back to him, looking out over the city. "You wanted to see me, Ellie?" he asked, his voice smooth and familiar. "I did, Gareth," she said, turning around. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking a great deal about the future, about loyalty, about who I can truly trust in my inner circle." Gareth's heart swelled with triumph. "Loyalty is everything," he agreed earnestly. "You know you can always count on me." "I'm beginning to realize that," she said, her voice dangerously soft. She walked to her desk and picked up the tablet. "In fact, your recent diligence has been very illuminating." She slid the tablet across the polished obsidian desk. Gareth looked down, his confident smile freezing on his face. On the screen was a crystal-clear image of him, standing at the counter of a convenience store, purchasing a burner phone. "I believe a promotion is in order," Eleonora said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "To head of corporate espionage, though it seems you're already an expert." The blood drained from Gareth's face. He stammered, a string of incoherent denials falling from his lips. "That's not... I can explain. That could be anyone." "Could it?" Eleonora swiped the screen. A call log appeared, showing the single call made from that phone to Julian's. She swiped again. A report from Corbin's tech team, detailing how the safe's alarm had been bypassed and Julian's keycard cloned during the security upgrade that Gareth himself had ordered. She had him. Every piece of his pathetic, treacherous plan was laid bare. "You did it to protect me, I assume?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. "From the poor, honest man who was making my mother happy? You decided to destroy him, to destroy a child's father, so you could what, Gareth? Take his place?" His composure finally snapped. "He didn't deserve you," he snarled, his face twisting into an ugly mask of entitlement. "I've been by your side for 10 years. I've earned it. He was a nobody, a piece of trash you picked up off the street." "You're right," Eleonora said, her voice deadly calm. He isn't like you. He has integrity, a concept you wouldn't understand. She pressed a button on her desk. Corbin will escort you from the building. Your assets have been frozen pending a full investigation. I will be pressing charges for theft, conspiracy, and corporate fraud. I will personally fund the prosecution, Gareth. I will spend millions to make sure you spend years in a place with no promotions at all. The door opened. Corbin stepped in. Gareth stared at her, his face a ruin of disbelief and hatred. He was broken, and he knew it. As Corbin led him away, Eleonora felt no triumph, only a vast, empty ache. The real reckoning was yet to come. She drove herself to Julian's apartment. No driver, no security. This was a debt she had to pay alone. Each block closer to his neighborhood felt like a mile. When she stood outside his door, her hand trembled as she raised it to knock. He opened it, and his face was a portrait of exhaustion and sorrow. When he saw her, what little light was left in his eyes went out. He braced himself, expecting another blow. "Julian," she began, her voice cracking. The apology she had rehearsed, the calm, logical explanation, it all evaporated. All that was left was the raw, ugly truth. "I know everything. It was Gareth. He framed you." Julian just stared at her, his expression unchanging. "I was a fool," she whispered, tears she hadn't shed in years now streaming down her face. "A blind, arrogant fool. I let him play on my worst instincts. I let myself believe the worst of you because it was easier than trusting my own heart. I hurt you, I accused you, and there is no excuse for what I did. I am so sorry." He was silent for a long time, the sounds of the city drifting up from the street below. She could see the battle in his eyes, the deep wound she had inflicted warring with the innate goodness of his character. "I was so scared," he finally said, his voice raspy. "When I saw you standing here, I thought you were going to have me arrested. I was afraid they would take Lily away." The simple, devastating confession shattered the last of her composure. "I know," she sobbed. "Julian, can you ever forgive me?" He didn't answer with words. He just looked at her, at the powerful, broken woman crying on his doorstep, and stepped aside, opening the door wider. He let her in. A year later, the sun was setting over a lush green lawn. The wedding was small, intimate, attended only by a handful of close friends and family. Julian stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the woman walking toward him. Eleonora. She wasn't wearing the armor of a CEO, but a simple, elegant dress, her face open and luminous with a happiness he had helped her find. The Star of Ardennes, recovered from a pawn shop weeks after Gareth's arrest, was clasped around Genevieve's neck as she stood proudly as the matron of honor. Julian's life was his own again. With the generous settlement Eleonora had insisted upon, he had started a foundation for deaf children, a tribute to Lily, who was now walking down the aisle as the flower girl, scattering petals with joyful abandon. As Julian and Eleonora joined hands, Lily stood before them. She looked from her father to her new mother, a wide smile on her face. Her small hands came up, and in the golden evening light, she signed the words that had brought them all together, a silent language that had bridged worlds and healed hearts. "I love you." Julian's hand tightened on Eleonora's. Theirs was not a storybook romance. It was a story of broken trust rebuilt, of forgiveness earned, of two vastly different worlds colliding to create a new one, stronger and more beautiful than either could have been on its own. They were not the billionaire and the waiter. They were a family. And as they looked at each other, they knew their real lives were just beginning. So, that's the end of our story. I really hope a piece of it stays with you. If there was a moment, or even just a character that really hit home, I'd honestly be honored to read about it in the comments. It's just amazing to see how one story can land in so many different ways. Look, if you believe stories like this are a kind of light we need in the world, your support means everything. When you like and subscribe, you're doing more than just helping a channel grow. You're really casting a vote for stories that aren't afraid to look at what makes us human and you're helping that light find someone who might be in the dark. Thank you for lending me your time. It means a lot. Until the next chapter, take care of yourselves and each other.